Okay, so the endocrine system, it is a system that has many organs and tissues that are distributed throughout the body and don't necessarily physically connect as most of the organs in the organ system. They do communicate these organs and function together with the aid of chemical messengers that we call hormones. So we're going to see in this chapter the major functions of the endocrine system. We're going to see what processes these regulate and how they contribute to maintain homeostasis. And we're going to compare systems that control other systems. So we're going to compare endocrine system to nervous system and see what is the difference between them in terms of mechanisms of control, signaling pathways, target specificity, and response to these messages that they send. We are also going to see the difference between the classic hormones and neurohormones. We're going to list the classes of hormones, the chemical classes that there are, and we're going to see how they bind into receptors either in the plasma membrane or in the nuclear area in the nucleus, and how they produce a reaction in the body. As well, we're going to see what regulates the excretion of these hormones and what are the feedback mechanisms that controls the amount of hormones that are released. As well, we're going to see physical connection between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, how it is made, and what are the differences between the anterior part of the pituitary gland and the posterior part of the pituitary gland. We're going to see the hormones that are secreted by each of these parts of the pituitary gland and what is the mechanism of action. As well, of course, we have to see what hormones are produced by the hypothalamus and how they act over the pituitary gland. And we're going to see the generic name for the modes of action, including what is paracrine, autocrine, endocrine, exocrine, etc. And we're going to see also some chemical messengers that are not precisely defined as hormones, but they are important. We will see eicosanoids, growth factors, and nitric oxide. And we're going to see the long and short-term effects of these hormones, as well the interaction of the different body systems with the endocrine system, which we will see as well in each of these systems. So whenever, for instance, we start talking about the reproductive system, I will remind you, well, FSH, you remember where it comes from and what it does, so we will see these hormones again and again. So first, the endocrine system is made out of glands and tissues. The glands are located everywhere in the body. We have it in the head, in the neck, thorax, abdomen. So they're scattered. And then we have several tissues that, similarly as to glands, they produce and secrete hormones. Now, the endocrine system secretes hormones into the bloodstream. That's why these hormones are endocrine. So endo, if you remember, means inside, and exo means out. So then the hormones of the endocrine system that goes into the bloodstream, into a blood vessel, will be considered endocrine hormones. Whenever something is secreted to the exterior part of our body, that will be exocrine. And then, why does these hormones go into the bloodstream? Well, to reach distant organs. So, for instance, growth hormone. It is produced in the pituitary gland that we have in the brain, goes into the bloodstream, and then from the bloodstream goes into the bones and the muscles that we have throughout the body, and then they grow. Okay? So you have to have a way to reach these distant organs, which in this case will be the blood vessels, because the blood vessels are found everywhere in our body. And then the function will be to maintain homeostasis of different parts, like maintaining specific levels of glucose, helping us to digest, helping us to produce certain cells so that we can reproduce, like sperm cells, egg cells. So it helps to maintain homeostasis, control growth, perform metabolism, help us to maintain and perform metabolism, like thyroid hormone, for instance. And then they are secreted in response to stress. Example, cortisol. Cortisol is a hormone that is secreted by the adrenal gland, which is on top of the kidneys. And that helps us to mobilize glucose so that we can respond to this stress. That's an acute response. Long-term cortisol levels are not good for our body. But when someone has an acute response to stress, it will release cortisol. And it works together with the nervous system to provide sustained response. While the nervous system acts quickly, the endocrine system maintains this response. So, hormones are defined as chemical messengers that regulate body functions in several tissues. And then these hormones are derived from the endocrine glands and endocrine tissues, of course. Endocrine tissues are clusters. The glands are surrounded by a capsule, while the tissues are not surrounded by a capsule, and they are clusters that are located nearby organs. And then these hormones reach target cells that has specific receptors. If the receptor is not there, or if it's defective, there is no response, no matter that the hormone is at right levels or if it is the right hormone. So it's like trying to open your house, the lock of your house, with your car keys. There is a specificity. And then what if the lock is defective, but the key is not defective? Then you won't open the lock, or vice versa. What if the key is effective and the lock is okay? Then you won't open the door. So both the hormone and the receptor has to be right. Otherwise, you won't have a response. Difference between nervous and endocrine system. So the nervous system uses neurons to produce a rapid short-term response that is targeted. So neurons act quickly. And then endocrine system uses hormones that are produced by cells within this gland or the tissue, and they produce a response that is slow, widespread, and is long-lasting. So the message of the endocrine system lasts longer and is more widespread than the one from the nervous system. The intensity differs. So you have nervous system that works with a particular number or frequency of the action potentials, which is the unit for the functioning of the nervous system. And in terms of the hormone, you work with concentration. How many milligrams of that hormone you have in your body. That will determine what will be the effect, if of course you have normal responding receptors. So while the nervous system works with how many action potentials you produce, in the case of the endocrine system, how many milligrams or concentration of hormones you have. For the transport of the hormones, they are transported in the blood, and they are secreted by the cells of the endocrine system first into the interstitial fluid, the fluid that surrounds these cells. And then from there, these hormones, by diffusion, will move from the interstitial fluid into the bloodstream. Now, this diffusion includes having nearby capillary beds. So the capillaries are the tiniest blood vessels that we have in our body, and they are porous. They can absorb these hormones. So then when these hormones goes from a higher concentration to a lower concentration, and they find several capillaries, the hormones traverse the walls of the capillaries, and then they go into the bloodstream so that they can be distributed. And then the hormones will go into the veins, and then it will go into the heart, and the heart will transport temporarily these hormones within these chambers to pump it into the arteries that connects into the heart. And then from the arteries, it will go to the entire body. So it's a sequence then. So you produce the hormone, it will diffuse into the interstitial fluid, goes into the capillary beds, goes into the veins, goes into the heart, and then into the arteries, and then into the entire body. And then depending on the tissue is whether you will have receptors for that hormone or not, and whether you will have receptors or not. The number of receptors can vary with time and physiological function. Sometimes can be upregulated and increase in number, sometimes can be downregulated or decrease in number. So here is the diagram showing you the changes of place for these hormones. So here we have a couple of endocrine cells. This cell produces the hormone, which is represented by these triangles, purple triangles. Then it goes, these hormones first into the space outside these cells, which is called the interstitial space, where you have interstitial fluid. And then from there, the capillaries absorbs this hormone, and these capillaries are found in the capillary beds, and then these capillary beds will form these veins. These veins will return the blood into the heart. The heart will pump it into the arteries, and then the hormone will exit these capillary beds in the tissues. So here are the cells in the tissues, and then the hormones will reach these receptors, in this case, in the surface of the cells, in the plasma membrane. So these are specific for these receptors, these hormones. Any questions about the transport? So the classification of hormones by their site of action. So we have some hormones that travels through the blood vessels. In this case will be endocrine hormones. Examples will be thyroid hormone and insulin. We can have paracrine hormones, which will be the hormones that act on nearby cells, neighboring cells. So examples will be these eicosanoids, leukotrienes, that are released by tiny cells, and then they act over the nearby cells. And where does these eicosanoids come from? Typically, they come from the injury of the plasma membrane of the cells. So if someone, for instance, has a a wound, in these cells will release these eicosanoids, which are lipid messengers, and then you start inflammation so that you can start repairing that wound. So we also have hormones that act on the same cell that it produced them. So this, in this case, will be autocrine hormones. So autocrine, auto means same. And then they diffuse locally into the extracellular fluid, so they don't reach the actual bloodstream. Other local messengers, we have growth factors, like, for instance, epidermal growth factor, or EGFR. We have platelet-derived growth factor that helps for the platelets to basically grow. We have nitrous oxide, which is a gas that causes vasodilation. You will see that again in the reproductive system. And in the case of growth factors, they stimulate the cell growth and differentiation. That's why they're called growth factors. So any question about this classification of the hormones based on the site of action? So here is the hormone targets. So this endocrine cell produces these hormones that goes into the bloodstream, and then they reach these distant cells that will have receptors for this hormone. So that's the target, distant cells in the case of endocrine hormones. In the case of paracrine hormones, the tissues will have cells, some of them, they will release these paracrine chemicals that migrate in the extracellular fluid, and then they reach near cells. And then the autocrine, it is a specialized cell that releases autocrine chemicals, and it has receptors that act on the same cell. Some lymphocytes work this way with the the autocrine signals. So let's compare this type of messages, maybe with an invitation to a party, or saying what you're doing, or what potentially you can do. So if you were a hormone and then you were an endocrine hormone, what pathway would you use to reach distant people that you know to receive that message? Like, let's say you're here and then you have family member in a continent that it's another continent. What would you do? Or do you have friends there?
Have to get secreted for one, and then from that you go to intercellular fluid to the capillaries.
What media would you use? To can be a phone call. What else? Text message, right? As well. What about your neighbor? And you talk to your neighbor. You go over, right? And what about if you need to do something? What will be your autocrine signal? You write a note, right? So that's the comparison. Autocrine, it's a note for yourself. Paracrine, go and talk to your neighbor, and then sending a text message using social media to reach friends distantly. That's endocrine. Okay, so major endocrine organs, sorry about the slides cluttered. So we will work with each of these. Hypothalamus. It connects the endocrine and the nervous system. So the hypothalamus, if you remember, it is located just below the thalamus, which is a structure that looks like an egg that is located just below the lateral ventricles from your AMP1, if you remember. So this hypothalamus produces hormones that are called releasing and inhibiting hormones. And then these releasing and inhibiting hormones will send signals or messages to the pituitary gland, which is just below the hypothalamus. It is connected to the hypothalamus by the stalk. And then these releasing or inhibiting hormones will make the pituitary gland to secrete hormones or to produce hormones or not. It depends. If it's a releasing hormone, it will make the pituitary gland to release these hormones or produce them. But if it's an inhibiting hormone, it will do the opposite. It's like a stop and go signal. That's the hypothalamus. Now, in the epithalamus, we have the pineal gland, which is a tiny gland that secretes melatonin. Do you remember what is the action of melatonin?
Sleep-wake cycle?
Yes, in the sleep-wake cycle, it helps you to fall asleep. That's melatonin. And then the pituitary gland is subdivided into posterior and anterior. The posterior does not produce hormones. It only releases hormones that stores there. So it stores vasopressin and also oxytocin. Another name for vasopressin is antidiuretic hormone, right? ADH. Some hormones have more than one name. Not so many, but some of them, like, they have. Now, ADH is the abbreviation for antidiuretic hormone that typically you use. We will see the functions of each of these hormones. For the anterior pituitary gland, it produces several hormones, including hormones that controls growth, metabolism, reproduction, and stress response. So let me write down here some hormones of the anterior pituitary gland. Pituitary. If I'm missing one, it will come later. But basically, these are some of these hormones that are secreted and produced by the anterior pituitary gland. Growth hormone, melanocyte stimulating hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, prolactin, thyroid stimulating hormone, and adrenocorticotropic stimulating hormone. Thyroid gland as a whole regulates metabolism and calcium balance. Calcium balance is very important for life because the heart contracts 24/7. It has to have the right amount of calcium. No matter if your diet is poor in calcium, the heart will always have to have that specific amount. And then we have the parathyroid glands that are located posteriorly to the thyroid gland that will chew up your bones so that you can give the calcium that the heart needs to contract. So these two, thyroid gland and parathyroid glands, control calcium levels. And then thymus, which is a gland that is located anterior and superior to the heart in young animals and young people, it secretes hormones that helps for the immune system cells, the lymphocytes, to be mature. So it is involved in immune cell development. Adrenal glands, they have two portions. So we have this gland on top of the kidneys that are called the adrenal glands. So it has the middle part, which is the adrenal medulla, and we have the outer part that is the adrenal cortex. The adrenal cortex secretes more hormones than the medulla. And the medulla secretes hormones that regulate the flight or fight response. So it secretes epinephrine and norepinephrine, what we call catecholamines. While the adrenal cortex secretes hormones that regulate sugar, salt, water content, and also the development of secondary sex characteristics. So we will see each of these hormones produced by the adrenal glands. So it produces corticosteroids and catecholamines. And then the pancreas secretes two important hormones for the regulation of glucose levels in our bloodstream, which will be insulin and also glucagon. It secretes another hormone that it is called somatostatin that regulates the levels of insulin and glucose, so you don't have, insulin and glucagon, so that you don't have swings in the levels of glucose, so that more or less you regulate that. And then the ovaries and the testes, they are mixed glands that produces testosterone, estrogens, progesterone, and inhibin. And as well, they secrete the exocrine products, which will be the sperm cells in the case of testes, and in the case of the ovaries will be the egg cells. So here is the location of all of these glands. And again, just as I told you at the beginning, this is one of the systems where the majority of these organs, they don't physically connect, but at least chemically connect to perform their function. So here we have the region of the brain where we have these tissues, which includes this hypothalamus in here, the pineal gland in the epithalamus, and the pituitary gland with the anterior part and the posterior part. If you remember from your AMP1, this is the sella turcica of the sphenoid that holds the pituitary gland. And then here we have the crossing of the optic nerves, the optic chiasma. Some people may develop a tumor in the pituitary gland and they compress the optic chiasma and they will have visual problems. So these are the glands or the endocrine organs of the brain. Now in the neck, we have the thyroid gland, which has these two lobes connected by this middle region that's called the isthmus. And it has these little indentations that make it look like if you were like rough. And then this is the anterior view. If you flip it and see the posterior view, you can see 4 to 6, or sometimes even up to 8 parathyroid glands. These are like the size of a grain of rice, so they are very tiny, but they are very important for the control of calcium levels, parathyroid glands. And then here in the thorax, anterior to the heart, we have the thymus. That has kind of similar surface to the thyroid gland. They have like these little indentations in the surface. And then in the abdomen, on top of the kidneys, these are the kidneys, we have this almost pyramidal shaped gland, which is the adrenal gland. So if you magnify the adrenal gland and you make a sagittal section or a frontal section, you can see the layers. This external layer will be the cortex, and this middle layer will be the medulla. And then in the retroperitoneal space, we have this gland that looks like a hammer. This is the pancreas. So this is the head, this is the body, and this is the tail. Like this will be like if you want the handle of the hammer. And then the pancreas, just like as the ovaries and the testes, are mixed glands. Mixed because they have an endocrine secretion and an exocrine secretion. The exocrine goes to the outside of the body, the endocrine stays in the bloodstream. So the pancreas secretes insulin, glucagon, and somatostatin that controls glucose levels, and secretes pancreatic juices that will help for the digestion of the foods that we ingest. And now, in the pelvic cavity, females have ovaries that secrete estrogens, progesterone, and inhibin, and they secrete the egg that goes to the outside of the body. In the case of males, the testes are located in the scrotum, and they secrete testosterone and inhibin. Any questions? So, the chemical classes of hormones. Well, we have hormones that are made out of peptides. And these peptides, remember, are the subunits for proteins. So these peptides are water soluble and they bind to the receptors in the surface of the plasma membrane. And what they do is they amplify the signal through chemical messengers, which are called second messengers, activate second messengers inside the cells. Now, steroid hormones are lipid-based. They derive from cholesterol. And these, since they're lipid-based, they can cross to the plasma membrane. If you remember, the plasma membrane is made out of a bilipid layer. So in this case, you don't need a receptor. They cross the plasma membrane and they reach intracellular receptors that are located within the DNA of the cells, and they activate transcription. That's the mechanism of action of these steroid hormones. And then some of them are amino acid derived, like amine hormones, that has only one single amino acid, and they have different type of receptors depending on the cells, and they can bind either to the plasma membrane or intracellular, depending on what what hormone it is. So here are some examples of these hormones. Steroid hormones. We have, for instance, testosterone, we have progesterone, we have estrogens, all are derived from cholesterol. And then the peptide, which are these like insulin, glucagon, they bind to the surface of the cells in their receptors. Now, some hormones, they can work better together, in this case are synergistic, but some of them can be antagonistic. Their action doesn't work well together, and they can have opposite effects. So, examples of some hormones that are synergistic, we have glucagon and epinephrine, that both increases blood glucose levels. And then we have antagonistic, like glucagon, that rises glucose levels, while insulin does the opposite, drops the blood glucose levels. So now in terms of hormones, they don't last forever in the body. They have a half-life. Half-life is the average time that it takes for the hormone to have half of the amount that it was initially released in a particular amount of time. So basically, it's the time that it takes for getting rid of half of the amount of the hormone that the gland produced. So to be eliminated from the bloodstream. When you have a short half-life, that means that you will have eliminated faster that hormone versus when you have a long half-life. And then depending on the half-life, it's the biological effect. The longer that you have the hormone in your body, the longer that you expect the effect to take place, and vice versa. If it's a hormone that has short half-life, well, you better use it as quick as possible as well, otherwise you won't have as much effect. But that is kind of a generality, because in reality, what happens is, depending on the number of hormones that you have, receptors that you have. Some people don't have as much receptors as others for particular hormones, and in that case, half-life yes, it does affect, because you will have, if you have very few receptors, you might want to have a hormone that has longer half-life, but eventually when the kidneys get rid of these hormones, they get rid of them, and then you don't have it anymore. And if you have very few receptors, then it will be kind of a waste. And that's why we regulate the amount through feedback mechanism. So it's not as easy as, yeah, the body is just wasting energy and making something that is not going to be used. No, it is used. So here is an example of water-soluble hormone mode of action. So all of this space in blue that you see on top, this represents ECF. Remember what is ECF? Extracellular fluid. So, if you have a hormone in the extracellular fluid and binds to this receptor, then that hormone is not going to be free anymore. It's going to be a bound hormone. But in this case, it's going to be a bound hormone to the cell receptor, because some hormones can bind to transporters that we have in the bloodstream. Lipid-soluble hormones are not transported free in the bloodstream. They have to bind to a receptor. Now, in this case, this hormone, which is water-soluble, binds into this receptor, and this receptor is embedded within the plasma membrane. So here are the two layers of lipids in the plasma membrane. And then you have attached into this internal part of the receptor this G protein. This G protein has subunits, and these subunits can detach, like in this case, this G protein subunit detached from this G protein, and then goes and binds into this other protein that it is embedded within the plasma membrane. This is an enzyme. This is called adenylate cyclase. When this G protein subunit binds to this adenylate cyclase, then adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, will be converted into cyclic AMP. And then you release inorganic phosphate. And this cyclic AMP is going to activate some proteins that are called protein kinases. Protein kinases help to attach phosphate groups to substrates, in this case proteins, so that you can amplify the signal. And then you start a cascade that helps for the cells to increase transcription or to have a particular behavior, depending on the type of hormone. Increase metabolism, slower metabolism, absorb sugar, not absorbed it, make a response. So that's how you amplify this signal. In the case of lipid-soluble hormones, again, because they're lipid-soluble, they can cross this plasma membrane, and again, here you have the ACF in this top part, and this spheres represents this lipid-soluble hormone. So they can traverse or cross this plasma membrane easily, and then they reach an intracellular receptor, and then they translocate both the receptor and the hormone into the nucleus, and then this hormone and receptor complex interact with the DNA. They bind to places where you can increase transcription. And transcription is basically making messenger RNA out of DNA. And then based on the messenger RNA that you have is what the cell will do. And then this messenger RNA will exit through this nuclear pore. So this is the nuclear membrane, and the nuclear membrane has nuclear pores. Any questions about the action of lipid-soluble versus water-soluble? So lipid-soluble increases transcription, does that in the nucleus. Water soluble acts on increasing cell signaling in the cytoplasm. So what is the stimuli that initiates hormone secretion? Well, the presence of other hormones like GHRH, which stands for growth hormone stimulating hormone, growth hormone releasing hormone. Let me write it down there. GHRH, growth hormone releasing hormone. So growth hormone releasing hormone is going to reach the pituitary gland, and the pituitary gland starts producing growth hormone, or GH. So this is a hormonal stimuli. GH is secreted because there is another hormone present. Humoral stimuli. Humoral refers to blood concentration of a particular ion or nutrient. For instance, when you have high glucose levels in your bloodstream, that's the humoral stimuli to make your pancreas to release insulin. And then neural stimuli, direct nervous input. For instance, a stimulation of axons in the adrenal medulla leads to the production and release of epinephrine and norepinephrine. So, here we have this stimulus. So, here is the pituitary gland, and here's the hypothalamus. And this is the anterior pituitary gland, and this is the hypothalamus. So when the hypothalamus releases this GHRH, it goes into these capillaries and then reaches the anterior pituitary gland, and then the anterior pituitary gland cells start producing this growth hormone. And why this anterior pituitary gland produces growth hormone? Because it has a receptor for growth hormone. Not all the anterior pituitary gland has growth hormone receptors. Only this particular type, and then it will produce this growth hormone that now is going to be released into the bloodstream to reach distant organs. So, now, that's the hormonal stimulation. Once this growth hormone reaches these cells and the cells grow, growth hormone is not needed anymore. So the cells will produce a hormone, or a chemical messenger that is called somatostatin, and somatostatin binds to these same cells, but now into these receptors for somatostatin, and then growth hormone won't be produced anymore. So that's the feedback mechanism. For humoral stimulus, again, someone had a meal, it has carbohydrates in it, so it has glucose in it. Glucose rises in the bloodstream, and then the pancreas releases insulin. So this is the pancreatic islet cell after it receives glucose, so that the insulin can go and travel distantly into different cells, and the cells will now have the way to bring that glucose into the cells by glucose transporters. So that's the humoral stimulus. Concentration of chemicals in the bloodstream. Neural stimulus will be these axons and the axon terminals releasing these molecules to activate the adrenomedulla cells to release epinephrine and norepinephrine. These chemical messengers can be the same. And then these epinephrine and norepinephrine that were produced by these adrenomedulla cells now goes into the bloodstream, and then they reach the different organs, and then you have the different responses. So then we can create the feedback loops. So feedback loop, just like as a reflex, you have a stimulus, which will be a physiological variable that deviates from the normal. And then you will have a receptor that detects this change. If the hormone goes down or up, or the ions of calcium goes up and down. And then you will have a control center, which will be the endocrine cell, that will know how much hormone to be released, or maybe not. And then once the hormone is released, it will bind to the target cell receptors, so that's the effector response. And then you move back the variable to normal levels, and then you will stop because you return to normal. So that's the negative feedback mechanism in the case of most hormones, with the exception of others like oxytocin, in which they act over positive stimuli or positive feedback rather than negative feedback. So here we have this loop. So this is the normal range in the middle, goes to low. Then these receptors detect that change, that things are low, and then they start producing hormones that goes into the bloodstream, and then it reaches this control center, and then the control center, which is often the same endocrine cell, can increase or decrease the secretion of a particular hormone. And then this hormone, when it's released into the bloodstream, it will reach these distant cells, and then you will have a response from these cells to return back the variable to normal. So what is the anatomical and functional relationship between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland? Well, it depends on what part of the pituitary gland. The anterior pituitary gland has a physical connection with the hypothalamus through capillaries. And then the posterior pituitary gland has a physical connection with the hypothalamus by axons that extend between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. And everything runs in the stalk. It's located in that tiny hanging tissue between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. Another name for the anterior pituitary gland is adenohypophysis. And another name for the posterior pituitary gland is neurohypophysis. This is because this one has neurons in them, like the axons, while this one has glandular tissue. And then the actual functional connection between the anterior pituitary gland and the hypothalamus is called the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system, and axis. Hypothalamus, hypophyseal axis. And then the posterior pituitary gland, it only stores hormones. It doesn't produce hormones. So we have a couple of nucleus within, or areas within the hypothalamus that produces oxytocin and ADH, antidiuretic hormone. And whenever they are needed, they will be released by the posterior pituitary gland. So neural signals controls the release of these hormones in the posterior pituitary gland, while humoral stimuli controls the release of hormones in the anterior pituitary gland. Another name for this region of the stalk, it is called infundibulum. And then here we have the connection between the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary gland. And here will be the connection between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary gland. So capillaries in this region, axon in here. And the capillaries are called the portal system in this case. So for the hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system, this system is specialized because you have interchange of hormones between this hypothalamus and hypophyseal system using exchange with these veins. So these veins are part of a portal system of veins that travels between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, and a portal system of capillaries doesn't require the pumping action of the heart to transport molecules. In this case will be the hormones between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, which will be either releasing hormones or inhibiting hormones. So this will allow the hypothalamus to exert an action over the pituitary gland, and then you can affect the rest of the body. So here is better seeing these connections between the posterior pituitary gland and the hypothalamus. So you can see the body of the neurons is here in the hypothalamus, and here's the axons, and then they reach these tissues, these cells, so that you can release these hormones into these capillaries and these veins to go into the systemic circulation. And then in here, you have the hypophyseal portal system between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So what does each of these hormones in the anterior pituitary gland do? Growth hormone stimulates growth and metabolism. Thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH, controls the release of hormones by the pituitary gland. Adrenocorticotropic hormone stimulates the adrenal cortex to release the different hormones. And then FSH and LH regulate the function of the gonads. What are the gonads? Ovaries and testes. And then prolactin stimulates the production of milk by the mammary gland. So here is the feedback loop. Most of the times, anywhere in our body, our cells produce more than what we need, so our body cells are very generous. So in this case, you have a variable that deviates high from the range, so you have more of a particular hormone than usual. And then in your first tier control, the hypothalamus releases hormones. And then the second tier, the anterior pituitary gland releases hormones, but in the third tier, you will have the target organs releasing hormones. And then you have the effect, which will be, in some cases, to release hormones so that you can have healthy tissues or growth of the tissues, or maybe producing egg cells or sperm cells. And then once you have the effect, there is no more need to keep producing hormones, starting releasing hormones here, and then stimulating hormones here, and then tropic hormones from these target glands. So since you already did the effect, why you want more? In this case, you send a negative feedback so that you can prevent the anterior pituitary gland and the hypothalamus from producing more hormones when they are not needed. So what are the targets of the different hormones? For the anterior pituitary gland, prolactin or PRL will be the lactiferous sinus in the mammary gland. In the case of thyroid stimulating hormone, will be the cells, the follicular cells in the thyroid gland, so that you can produce thyroid hormones, T3 and T4. In the case of adrenocorticotrophin hormone, tropic hormone, will be the adrenal cortex. In the case of FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, will be the testes and the ovaries. In the case of LH, luteinizing hormone is the same. In the case of growth hormones, all the tissues in our body, including the liver, muscle, and bone, cartilage. So, what stimulates the release of PRL and TSH? Thyrotropin releasing hormone, or TRH, produced by the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus produces this TRH, then the anterior pituitary gland produces PRL in the case of lactating woman, and in the case of everyone will be TSH in the thyroid gland. And then for corticotropin releasing hormone, which is secreted by the hypothalamus, will stimulate the secretion of ACTH, which will stimulate the adrenal cortex to produce different hormones, tropic hormones, like cortisol, like aldosterone. In the case of GnRH, don't confuse GnRH with GHRH. GnRH stands for gonadotropin releasing hormone. This one stimulates FSH, LH to be released by the pituitary gland so that you can have effect on the testes or the ovaries. And then GHRH, growth hormone releasing hormone, stimulates the release of growth hormone so that you have growth in all of these tissues through insulin-like growth factor, or EGF. It's a growth factor that you release. Some of the short-term effects, well, would be to inhibit glucose uptake by the skeletal muscle, by GH, and then stimulate gluconeogenesis in the liver. If you remember, gluconeogenesis is making glucose out of substrates that are not carbohydrates, like lipids, like proteins. So then growth hormone inhibits glucose uptake by skeletal muscle, and then stimulates gluconeogenesis in the liver, and stimulate lipolysis in fat. So what are the effects of these first two? Increased blood glucose concentration. So that's why you prevent the skeletal muscle from taking glucose, so that you can increase blood glucose concentration, and then that's why you stimulate the liver to produce glucose, so that the rest of the cells in the body starts growing. And then in lipolysis, you increase fatty acid concentration so that you can stimulate the formation of new cells. And then in the case of GH, long-term effects with this EGF, insulin growth-like factor, that is released by not only the liver but also muscle, bone, and other tissues, you will stimulate glucose uptake by several cells. That decreases blood glucose concentration, stimulate cell division, so you stimulate mitosis, especially of cartilage and bones so that you increase in length and width your bones. And then your muscle cells start increasing with increased protein synthesis. So those are the long-term effects. So here is the feedback loop for growth hormone. Hypothalamus releases GHRH. It reaches through this hypophyseal portal system, hypothalamic hypophyseal portal system, it reaches the anterior pituitary gland. Your cells in your anterior pituitary gland secrete GH, and then GH or EGF will reach these different tissues, and then you have growth of bone, growth of muscle, and then you have lipolysis, etc. And then you have growth of all these tissues, and then you have a negative feedback to prevent the anterior pituitary gland to secrete more growth hormone, or the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus will also not release any more GHRH under the influence of somatostatin, which will be part of the negative feedback loop. Any questions? So we will leave it there.